You're watching four men ride into empty country with cloth tied over their eyes. It is June of 1872. They have been 4 days on horseback through canyons, through heat, behind a guide who keeps stopping to consult a compass. On the last stretch, the guide blindfolded them, and one of them is quietly counting the turns. He is counting because some part of him already suspects that the turns do not go anywhere. These are the men a San Francisco syndicate has sent to verify the greatest mineral strike in America. In a few hours, they will be standing on it. The ground does have diamonds in it. The only question that matters is who put them there. To understand how men with that kind of money end up blindfolded on a mesa, you have to go back 2 years, to a San Francisco office at closing time, and to a Kentucky prospector who had spent his entire life being underestimated and had finally worked out exactly what that was worth. Philip Arnold was a Kentuckian out of Hardin County. And by 1872, he was in his early 40s. He had been a hatter's apprentice. He had fought in the Mexican War. In 1849, he went to California with his older first cousin, a quiet man named John Slack, and the two of them worked the placer diggings of the Sierra Nevada, waist deep in freezing water, panning gravel, living the way every other 49er lived, which is to say badly. Neither of them got rich. What separated Arnold from every other man who came home empty was patience, and a very precise understanding of how he looked to other people. He looked like nothing. He looked like a man beaten flat by 20 years of frontier work. Travel-stained coat, heavy beard, few words. The financier Asbury Harpending, who watched him for 2 years and never once saw through him, described Arnold sitting grimly erect like a vigilant old soldier, a rifle at his side and a buckskin package in his lap. That was the impression Arnold wanted, and he held it like an actor working a long run. The men he was about to take did not look like nothing. William Chapman Ralston, founder of the Bank of California, the most aggressive money on the West Coast in a city that had made its fortune capitalizing the Comstock lode, he believed the mountains would simply keep producing. Charles Lewis Tiffany, whose name was on the door of the most famous jewelry house in the country. And in time, a former commanding general of the Union Army, George B. McClellan. Several hundred miles east, a Yale-trained geologist named Clarence King was moving slowly across the high desert with a federal survey team, mapping the 40th parallel for the United States government. Remember him. He was walking the same country that was about to be put on the market. Arnold spent 1870 preparing. He took a clerk's job in San Francisco, assistant bookkeeper at the Diamond Drill Company, a firm that used industrial-grade stones in its equipment. He was not there for the wages. He was there for access and for the texts on diamonds and mineralogy that he read privately over months while everyone around him saw a middle-aged prospector filling in ledgers. In the late autumn of 1870, Arnold and Slack walked into the San Francisco office of a mining promoter named George D. Roberts. It was after hours. They were dusty, tired, and carrying a leather bag they said they needed to leave somewhere secure overnight. Roberts asked what was in it. They refused. He asked again. Then Arnold let 2 words slip as though against his own better judgment. Rough diamonds. The bag spent that night in a San Francisco vault, and nobody in the building had asked where the stones came from. Roberts had promised to keep it quiet. He kept it quiet for approximately as long as it took him to reach William Ralston and Asbury Harpending. Arnold never had to pitch anything to anyone. He withheld, and every time he refused to talk, the price went up. By the spring of 1871, the investors were pressing for a buyout. Slack, playing his role, exhausted, suspicious, borderline hostile, demanded $100,000, $50,000 of it in advance before either man would lead anybody anywhere. The investors paid it. That $50,000 was not a payday, it was a purchase order. In July of 1871, Arnold and Slack sailed for England under false names, Arnold traveling as Oundle, Slack using his middle name Bircham, and in London they bought roughly $20,000 worth of low-grade uncut diamonds, rubies, and sapphires from a merchant named Leopold Keller. Industrial refuse. Keller was puzzled enough to ask where they intended to have the stones cut. Back in San Francisco, Harpending spread a sheet across his billiard table. Arnold cut the fastenings on the sack and upended it. Harpending wrote later that the contents seemed like a dazzling, many-colored cataract of light. Grown men watched gravel come out of a bag, and what they saw was a fortune. In October of 1871, the stones went east to the Madison Avenue home of the attorney Samuel L. M. Barlow, where Charles Lewis Tiffany examined them in front of an audience that included Harpending, the investor William Lent, General McClellan, and a sitting congressman. Barlow poured the gems onto a tablecloth. Tiffany said they were beyond question precious stones of enormous value, but that he needed 2 days with his lapidary before naming a figure. 2 days later, he named it, $150,000 for a sample that was 1/10 of the parcel. The most trusted eye in America had looked at them and said yes. He was not qualified to, and nobody in the room knew that. Tiffany's expertise was in cut and polished stones, in retail settings and finished jewelry. Rough gems out of the ground were not his field, and he admitted it only later when it no longer helped anyone. What Arnold was doing has a name in mining. It is called salting. Physically placing valuable material into worthless ground so that ground appears to contain it. It is the oldest fraud in extraction, and in 1872 the United States was almost perfectly built to be unable to detect it. No American diamond deposit had ever been found, which meant no American had ever had reason to learn what one should look like, including the most famous jeweler in the country, who had no qualification in rough stones at all. And that same year, Congress passed the General Mining Act. A sitting congressman was paid 1,000 shares of the diamond company to amend it, adding 3 words, valuable mineral deposits, so that gems could be claimed on federal ground at all. So the law was bought before the ground was. And in a back room in Amsterdam in the winter of 1871, Philip Arnold was buying another $8,000 to $12,000 of rough stones to spread across it. Arnold took those stones out to a mesa in the northwest corner of Colorado Territory, in the shadow of a cone-shaped peak, and they went to work by hand, pushing gems into Anthills, tamping them into rock crevices, scattering them across the topsoil of open ground that had never held a diamond in its existence. In June of 1872, the inspection party assembled. 6 men, Arnold, Slack, the mining engineer Henry Janin, General George S. Dodge, Asbury Harpending, and an Englishman named Alfred Rubery. They came in on the Union Pacific, got off at Rawlins in Wyoming Territory, and left the railroad behind. Then they rode. Arnold took them on a 4-day circuit through broken country, stopping frequently to squint at his compass, letting the party watch him appear to lose his bearings and find them again. For the last stretch, the investors and their engineer were blindfolded outright. They arrived at a place they could not have found again on their own, and would not have been able to describe to anyone else. Then, Rubery started yelling. Janin's account of the moment is almost childlike. Rubery held something up, glittering in his hand, and it was a diamond. Any fool could see that much, Janin said, and then, in his words, they began to have all kinds of luck. The men got down on their knees in the dirt of a Colorado mesa in their traveling clothes, and dug gems out of anthills with their fingers. Henry Janin was the most respected mining engineer on the Pacific Coast. His signature on a report was the standard by which West Coast mining investment was judged. He was paid $2,500 for this inspection, plus the right to buy 1,000 shares of the resulting company at $10 each. He walked the ground, he examined the finds, and he certified the field. That certification was the product. On the strength of it, the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company was incorporated in July of 1872, capitalized at $10 million, 100,000 shares at $100 apiece. 25 prominent San Francisco men subscribed $80,000 each, putting $2 million of hard capital in the door before a single stone had been mined. A subscription office opened in London. Prestige names went onto the prospectus, McClellan's among them, and the Rothschild name with it because names are what sell paper. In August, the United States Attorney General issued a formal opinion confirming that diamonds counted as valuable mineral deposits under the new mining law, which cleared the last legal obstacle. San Francisco jewelers put rough stones on velvet in their windows. Crowds stood on the sidewalk in the gaslight to look at them. The papers called it diamond fever. And by then, the two men who had found the field were already gone, and nobody had noticed. Arnold had taken his final buyout, $450,000, and gone home to Kentucky. Slack collected his $100,000 and simply stopped existing as a public person. Together, with the advance, they had walked away with something north of $500,000 in 1872 currency, against roughly $40,000 in expenses. In today's money, their take was about $16 million. Arnold bought a large brick house on Cave Spring Hill in Elizabethtown and land and livestock. He wore tailored suits now. He grew out a mustache. He was a man of local standing in a town that had known him since before he had anything, and Kentucky liked him considerably more than California did. In October of 1872, on a train in California, a geologist named Samuel F. Emmons happened to run into Henry Janin. Emmons worked for Clarence King's Federal Survey. Janin, still riding the highest professional moment of his life, showed him some of the rough stones from the field. Emmons looked at them for a while. Something was wrong with the assortment, not the individual stones, but the company they kept. Diamonds and rubies do not form under the same conditions and do not lie together in the same topsoil. He took his unease to Clarence King. For King, the problem was not only the gems, it was the map. His survey had been working that country for years, which left two possibilities and no third. Either a diamond field of global significance was sitting in ground his teams had crossed and they had walked past it, or the field was not real, and $2 million of subscribed capital was resting on nothing. So while Philip Arnold was furnishing a house in Kentucky, Clarence King went to find out which. He staged out of Fort Bridger with a small team as the weather turned. It was late October, high desert, freezing at night. His men knew that country as well as anyone alive knew it. They matched the landforms against the descriptions coming out of the expedition, and they found the mesa, the site 4 men had been blindfolded to protect. And it was there. That is the part worth sitting with. The diamonds were exactly where they were supposed to be. King's men were pulling gems out of the Anthills almost immediately. Then they started counting. In natural deposits, proportions follow the geology. What King recorded on that ground was 12 rubies for every single diamond, a ratio that corresponds to no formation process on Earth, and corresponds very neatly to whatever a man happens to buy cheap in London. And it was not only the ratio. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, garnets, the ground held a catalog of stones that form under entirely different conditions in entirely different places and do not occur together anywhere on Earth. They were sitting in crevices in open rock, in topsoil that no water or ice had ever sorted. There were diamonds in the Anthills. And there was not one anthill on that mesa where nature could have put them. King rode for the coast. He reached San Francisco on the 10th of November and went directly to Henry Janin's hotel, where the two of them stayed up through the night, while a government geologist explained to the most trusted engineer in the American West exactly what he had put his name on. The next morning, the 11th, King walked into a meeting of the board of directors at the Bank of California. Before he read his findings, one of the directors floated a suggestion that there might be considerable money in it for King if publication were delayed a little, long enough for people in the room to position themselves against their own stock. King's answer became the most quoted sentence of his career. There was not enough money in the Bank of California, he said, to make him delay the publication a single hour. Then he read the report. he had hastened to San Francisco, it began to lay before them the fact that the new diamond fields on which such large investment and such brilliant hope were based were utterly valueless, and that they and their engineer, Mr. Henry Janin, were the victims of an unparalleled fraud. The directors did not take his word for it. They sent their own men out to look, and on the 25th of November, General David Colton reported back that he had seen rubies lying in places where it would have been as impossible for nature to have deposited them as for a man standing in San Francisco to toss a marble into the air and have it come down on the Bunker Hill Monument. The next day it was in the newspapers. The company was dissolved by vote of its own directors. The New York papers were merciless and they aimed low. Editorials mocked the proverbially shrewd businessmen of San Francisco for being outmaneuvered by a scientifically illiterate scheme run by two men in dirty coats. That was the wound. The money was survivable, the ridicule was not. Henry Janin did not survive it professionally. He had done the job as the job was defined in 1872. He went to the site, he examined the finds, he wrote what he saw. No one had ever asked a mining engineer to consider whether the gems in front of him had been placed there by hand, because no one in America had ever needed to. What the syndicate bought from him was not a mineral report. It was his judgment, borrowed, spent, and never returned. He had one asset, his name, and the men who hired him used it as collateral, and when it broke, they still had money, and he had a reputation that no longer worked. If you have ever taken a professional's word because the professional was famous, you already understand what happened in that room. William Ralston made a decision that tells you what he thought was at stake. Rather than let the Bank of California be publicly associated with a swindle, he personally reimbursed the investors out of his own funds and absorbed the loss himself. His institution had been the con's best reference. Every man who wrote a check had written it partly because Ralston's bank was standing behind the paper. There was a criminal case briefly. A grand jury in San Francisco returned an indictment against Arnold and Slack for fraud. It went nowhere, and it was never explained why. The contents of that indictment were never made public. The most detailed later account of the swindle, published in 1967, argues that the investors themselves quietly killed the prosecution, that the men who had been robbed decided a trial would only put them back in the newspapers, in the same posture for weeks. That remains a reported explanation rather than a documented one. What is documented is the outcome. No trial, no verdict, no jail. Arnold, in Kentucky, was untouchable in practice. Hardin County was not going to hand him over to California, and any jury that heard the case was going to be composed of his neighbors. So the investor William Lent sued him instead in civil court for the money. They settled out of court. Arnold returned $150,000, and the case against him ended there. He kept the rest. He kept the house, the land, and the standing. He opened a bank of his own in Elizabethtown and sat behind his own vault door. A man who had just run one of the largest frauds in the country, now trusted with money by the town he came from. Around town, he was regarded as something close to a local hero. The Kentucky boy who went west and beat the richest men in America at their own table. He was dead within 6 years in Elizabethtown. John Slack did none of that. He had taken $100,000, a fortune large enough to end work forever, and no one has ever established where it went. He went to White Oaks, New Mexico, a fading desert mining town, and lived the last 2 decades of his life as a carpenter and a coffin-maker. He kept to himself. He built boxes for other people's dead in a shop that smelled of cut pine, in a town where nobody knew what he had done. He died there in 1896 at 76. The estate he left behind was worth $1,600. The Bank of California failed in a run in 1875. Ralston died the following day. Clarence King was appointed the first director of the United States Geological Survey in 1879, and the case for federal science paying for itself was by then easy to make. That is the ledger. One engineer destroyed, one banker ruined, $2 million of subscribed capital erased, and the two men who caused it were never tried for anything. The richest men in America, holding every advantage the country could offer, made a straightforward calculation and concluded that being robbed quietly was cheaper than being laughed at in public. The mesa is still out there. It is barren and wind-scoured, and it has stayed that way. But when the government mapped that country properly, the surveyors marked the site with the name the swindle had given it, and it stayed. On United States Geological Survey topographic sheets today, that empty ground in the high desert is still labeled Diamond Field. Tell me in the comments, was Philip Arnold a con man who robbed the richest men in America? Or a prospector who gave them exactly what they had already decided they wanted? If this was the kind of story you can't look away from, there's another one waiting. Keep watching.